Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us as we continue our student-run conference, Study Tips for the New Year and Beyond. Before we jump into the presentation, we have just a couple of items to take care of. First off, we would like to record the presentation. If for any reason you're concerned with that, please just send me a message now before we get started. And next, this conference is organized by student volunteers and presented through the Launch School community. As such, we'll be following Launch School's Code of Conduct. If you have any specific questions about the Code of Conduct, feel free to message me directly. In a nutshell, just be kind and open-minded. And then today's talk is a slightly different format. It'll be a lightning talk presentation followed by QA and then a discussion group. So after the Q&A, if you want to stay for the discussion group, stick around. We'll just wait a couple minutes for anyone who wants to sign out and just join for the lightning talk, and then we'll jump into that. And then we can do all of the Q&A through the Q&A field, or if you want to use the raise hand feature later. And then last note is that we are at the tail end of this week of sessions. We have 2 more coming up this weekend. Building Tacit Knowledge and Software Development with Julius on Saturday, and Beyond Technical, Developing the Communication Skills Necessary for Successful Collaboration for Personal Study, Projects, and the Workplace with Callie on Sunday, and those are both at 2 p.m. Eastern. That will do it for now. With that, I will turn it over to Jose to start the presentation.
Hey everyone, hope you guys are well. I'm just gonna share my screen quickly. So can everyone see it? Yeah, yeah. Okay, I mean, first of all, thanks for being here and just taking some time to share some ideas. So the starting point of why I wanted to share this is that I wanted to reflect on what are some things that I anecdotally think are quite common based on conversations I've had with others, and at the same time that could be a low-hanging fruit for a lot of people. So this isn't a very specific discussion of, like a very structured plan on what you should do or anything like that, but more about like overarching principles and key ideas, which I think that if you're just mindful of these over the long run, they'll be helpful. So I'm calling it dangerous intuitions, because we make a lot of decisions based on intuitions. But at the same time, if we don't properly examine them, they can be dangerous over the long run. They could lead us to suboptimal outcomes. So just to start with, what are intuitions? Like, why do we make them? So I think there's a pretty standard definition. And if you think about it in terms of evolution and how we've evolved as a species, it makes a lot of sense, because we can't make very complex decisions all the time. We need some way that we can simplify our decision-making process, and intuition is one of those tools. So it's a very smart thing for us to have intuitions. The problem is that sometimes intuitions might not be correct. And so here, this is the key question that I want to explore. So what could be intuitions about learning that are harmful? And so the first one that I see a lot and that I've been guilty of for a long time is understudying, just the act of studying as learning in itself. And so what I mean with that is that obviously when you think about studying, let's say making notes, reading material, reading notes, etc., there is a function and a use for these. I'm not saying that there isn't a place for these things, but it's more the idea that studying will always involve learning. And so the idea is, if I read, if I highlight, if I write notes, am I always learning? Am I always in the path of getting to know? And what's really interesting is that it doesn't seem to be at least the most effective way to do so. So this is an interesting study that involves a group of people reading a poem and then either restudying it, as in rereading it or some similar technique, or otherwise being asked to remember what the poem said. And so as you can see from the first two bars, if you restudied it, as in, for example, you reread the poem, you would usually have a better recollection in the very short term. So in this 5 minutes part. But then if you were asked to recall it 2 days or a week apart, it wasn't the people that restudied it better, it was the people that were tested on it. So for me, this seems to be paradoxical, right? Like, how is it that at some points it works, at another point it doesn't? And what's going on here is that revision, what it did was it placed information in our short-term memories. And I think this is what explains this intuition that by studying, we're always learning. That, for example, by rereading some notes or rereading some passage or something like that, we are in the path towards learning it for the long term of mastering something. And so this is, for me, the key takeaway, this idea of revision as illusion. Illusion is very interesting. It's etymologically comes from illusio in Latin, which means cheats. And so it's a bit like that, right? It cheats you in the sense that it makes you think that you know it better. And just let's go back to it. In a sense, you do, because in the very short term, you'll have a better recollection. But if your goal is to learn it in the long term, then it is an illusion, right? You are, in a sense, cheating yourself. Now, the second intuition I'd like to explore is this idea that mastery is learning topics in isolation. And so what I mean with this is this idea that, for example, you learn, let's say, algebra separate from calculus, right? That they are isolated units of knowledge, and just in similar cases, right? And here there's another study that I found to be quite interesting. So here they tested two different things. So in one case, people were given content placed in blocks. So similar information was in a single block, and then they were given different blocks to study. And then in the second case, which is interleaved, these different blocks of content, they weren't separated, but they were interleaved, as in they were mixed together. So rather than having, for example, the three different parts split up strictly between them, you're like just mix them up all together, right? And so here what's going on is that when they were tested, the people that interleaved, as in they studied together the content, had a better comprehension than the people that blocked it out. So for me, the conclusion from this is that even if you might know a content in isolation, you might not necessarily be able to make the connections or to work with two different pieces of knowledge that you might know in isolation. So in that sense, it's this idea that learning is complementalized. So just to take this a bit further, you don't learn programming or you don't learn design. You learn a very specific skill that is, like, broadly speaking, in this realm that you might understand as programming or design, but it's not like design, for example, as a broad skill. It's a very specific skill within that. So you need to always be able to, as you're learning these very specific sub-skills, be able to make connections between them. And just moving on to the last one, there's something called learning as one-off, and it's this intuition or this idea that you finish learning something. And I think it's quite common. It's very, very common to say, I know something, I know X, or I've finished learning Y. as if learning were an end goal. And so in this case, it's quite interesting. This graph sort of represents just the underlying mechanism of how we remember and how we forget. And what's interesting here is that our ability to remember something that we've learned is also hinges in a part on how we repeat it, right? So for example, what this is essentially saying is that if you were to spread out the just a fixed time that you have allocated throughout, it's more effective than if you just chunk it in a single piece. So let's say if I have 4 hours to study per month something, it would be better to spread it out across an hour a week rather than in a single 4-hour block, right? Obviously, this isn't all of it, but it's just to summarize an implication. So yeah, so I think here the takeaway is that learning requires repetition. So in that sense, I'd like to reframe the idea that mastery is a destination, and I'd instead like to suggest that mastery isn't a destination, but rather a process, that we are always in the process of learning and trying to become masters of something. But we don't fully get there, especially in the context, again, of how learning degrades through time and how repetition helps us remember it. So just to bring this down into something a bit more tactical that you could implement, here are 3 things that I think could be useful, or at least that I've found to be useful. So the first one is to try to actively recall what you've learned. And my personal suggestion is to use paper, just because paper makes you slow down. It stops you from thinking with your fingers. And I think this especially goes back to the first topic that we discussed. The second one is to make connections with previous things that you've done. So don't just move on and forget what you've done in the past. Try to connect not only within a module, but also across modules. And also a bit related to that, though a separate thing in its own right, is teach what you've learned. And I think a dirty secret here is that when you're teaching, you're probably learning more than students. And I think this goes hand in hand with the second point, because teaching is a bit spontaneous. You don't really know everything that all the doubts that someone has. So it's always a great way to not only make connections with other things that you haven't thought of, but also to find your own blind spots. But yes, so that's everything from me on my end. Yeah, let me know if you guys have any questions or anything like that.
Awesome. Thank you, Jose, for sharing your lightning talk. We will do the Q&A now. We have a smaller group, so you can raise your hand if you want to just ask your question directly, or you can type it into the Q&A. All right, so Katarina has asked, first of all, thank you for your great presentation. I would like to ask, how do you space your repetition? What works best for you?
Sure. So in my case, I'm not one of those like productivity freaks that has like an extremely detailed system. Because I feel that sometimes a lot of people spend quite some time on the system itself. I'm a bit more laid back in that sense. So what I usually do is I try to make sure that I always teach things that I've already learned in the spot study sessions, because I just find that's a great way to commit myself to reviewing past material. So it's not like I have my Anki cards where like I know that in a week I'm going to get a set of cards and I'm going to review them. I think that could also be a solution. I just don't want to spend time like setting up a system. So yeah, for me, it's a bit more spontaneous. I just like find people to study things I've learned in the past. But this is probably something a bit personal. Obviously, this isn't, maybe you might want to invest a bit more in Anki cards or something like that, that might help you.
Great, thanks for answering. And our next question is from Lena. Hi, Jose. What ratio do you do of learning new materials versus reviewing previous knowledge you've already mastered?
So I think it depends on, yes, so I'm just starting from the point of I've already mastered the material, right? Rather than reviewing things that I'm in the process of learning. So for example, if I've already, so I'm thinking about modules I've already finished in the context of launch school. So in that sense, I usually spend about an hour or two, usually per week, reviewing past material. And again, relate to the previous question, it's basically just the study groups that I lead. So it's not something fixed. It might be more or it might be less, and it's very spontaneous. Which again goes back to the question that I don't think I have the perfect or the best system, if it even exists. And I'm usually just right now focused on going over new material.
Cool, thanks for letting us know. And Sahil is wondering, can you expand on how paper slows you down and avoid thinking with your fingers? Do you mean sketching instead of writing or typing?
Sure. Yeah. No, that's a great question. Okay, so the reason I brought it up is that I feel it's very easy to not be mindful or not reflect, especially when you're using something like a computer, because it's very easy to type something. It's very easy to, for example, I don't know, read through some content that's written in launch school about a topic, and then just write your notes almost by copying and not like really thinking about what's going on or like making connections. And I think it's hard to go over this precisely because it's so easy to type, because the friction is so low. So in that sense, the reason I like paper is that it's inherently slower. Just writing out a letter just takes a lot more time. So I feel that forces me to slow down, forces me to actually think a lot harder about what I'm doing and about the connections I want to make. Because I'm focused less on writing down words and more on what I'm going to do, just because it takes me more time to do it. There's actually this great anecdote from one of my favorite writers called Robert Caro. So he's this author who's basically written 5 books in his life, and they're these huge like Bible thick books. And he has this anecdote of when he was a student at Princeton. He was in a creative writing class, and a teacher of his told him something along the lines of, Mr. Carroll, you'll never get or like do what you want to do if you don't stop thinking with your fingers. So it's that same idea, which I think in this quotation is interesting because it makes that connection with something with a very different feels, right? Because with programming, I think the closest thing that comes to thinking with your fingers is hack and slashing, right? Because you just don't really think about it, you just like start doing it. But I find this quote interesting because it seems to refer to the equivalent of hack and slashing, but in a very different field, which is literature. And in that case, I also think what that was interesting is this connection with doing things very quick, not slowing down, and by extension, the need of slowing down in order to be more rigorous with your work.
Great, thank you for the very thorough answer. That will do it for Q&A. Oh, we have another one. Katarina has asked, What is your way to avoid studying material in blocks and instead make connections with the new material and what you already know?
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. So I think with just based on like most of the things that I've talked about, I think the great thing about launch school is that they've already taken care, I think, about most things. So they've already done a lot of heavy lifting for us. And that talks about the 3 points. And about specifically about this one and what I do, just me personally. One, I feel that writing down my hand helps me a lot, again, because of that I feel makes me slow down and make connections. Actually, most of the breakthroughs that I think I've had in my understanding and making connections has been when I'm writing stuff down. So when at the end of the day, I just get a piece of paper out and then I just write down what I've learned that day and trying to explain it to myself. For example, the type of things that I think is quite common is that as you're writing something down, I might question like, okay, what is the implication of this or something like that? And these extra questions that I wouldn't make when I'm writing just because I'm going so fast is what helps me make these connections. And secondly, it's related to this other suggestion I made. When you're teaching, since it tends to be at least partly spontaneous, because you don't control the questions that people make, that's also a great way to make connections. So it's usually for me these two things.
Awesome. Let's just give it another minute in case another question comes in. All right, so I think that we can wrap things up now. Thank you, Jose, for bringing up these important intuitions and sharing your insight.